family-oriented tradition in American psychology, has been without doubt the most influential leader in the counseling profession. Through his many writings, which include On Becoming a Person, Client-Centered Therapy, and on counseling and psychotherapy, and through national leadership, which has included the presidency of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Rogers has served as a model of scientific integrity, personal openness, genuineness, and warmth to 2 generations of professionals. From his early interest in individual therapy, his interests have broadened to include a deep and abiding concern with the process of education, best expressed in his book, Freedom to Learn. The potential of the encounter group movement, reflected in his book, Carl Rogers on Encounter Groups, and marriage and the relationships between men and women, the subject of his book, On Becoming Partners. In this film, Dr. Rogers interviews a couple about what the experience of partnership has been like for them. In a commentary after the interview, he indicates what he observed and learned from participating in the session.
So you're Carol, right? And you're Bob?
Yes, that's right.
Nice to meet you. You were in the group I talked to yesterday, weren't you?
Yes.
But I don't think we've met, have we?
No, we haven't met before.
Well, we'll both have a chance to get acquainted. Do you ever get teased about being Bob and Carol and where's Ted and Alice?
Right, all the time.
I'll tell you what I would like, and then I'll tell you why I would be interested in it. I'd like you to tell me whatever is important to you in your marriage partnership, or whatever has been or is at the present time. I don't care whether it's positive or negative, or whether you give very similar answers or whether they're very different. And I'd like to tell you a little of the reason for that. I really am quite interested in not only marriage, but its various alternative partnerships. I've tried to write a book on that. I feel that, I guess my feeling is you can get plenty of statistics about what marriage is like, and plenty of writing about the ideal marriage and what marriage ought to be and all this and that. But what interests me is what partnerships are actually like day by day and day after day and month after month and year after year, with their ups and downs and you know, their quarrels and their joys, and really to know it the way it is from inside, which I think is quite different from the way it gets pictured from the outside. So come back to my question. So I would just ask you, what are some of the elements that for you are or have been most significant in your own partnership? That's a pretty general question. We can carry on from there, and I'll probably toss in questions. Well, and one other thing I'd like to say, if I ask you something that you feel, oh, I don't want to talk about that, I would rather have you just say, no, I don't want to comment, than to sort of make up an answer, you know, that might sound all right, but isn't really the way it is. I don't mind at all if you say, no, I don't want to, but I would hope that whatever you do say is really the way it is for you. Mm-hmm. So I don't care which one of you wants to start, but perhaps you could tell me some of the things that have been really significant to you in your relationship.
Well, I think one of the biggest things right now is a kind of new discovering thing that we're just now going through. And that is that we've always talked about the importance of communication and living in the now, and we've talked about it a lot. Mm-hmm. But I think what we had to do to be able to get to actually be able to live in the now, or to be able to communicate, was to get a sense of separateness that we didn't have before, and I think that we both resented each other for, and hung a lot on the other person because we didn't feel separate. And so I think that this is the biggest thing in our marriage right now, is that we are beginning to now acknowledge that we are separate, and that it's okay to be separate, and that it's okay to be ourselves, and that we don't have to be the other person's image of us.
It's interesting, because I expect that would run counter to what a lot of people think, that you really feel that to learn to be separate has been a very important, fresh, and I gather helpful discovery in your marriage, is it?
Right.
It seemed like the first 4 or 5 years of our marriage, we attempted to do everything together and tried to be one unit and kind of one mind and one purpose. And the whole time, looking back now, it was we were getting more angry at each other, more frustrated, more unhappy, I guess, as a married unit, and really not having enough sense to reach out or try to figure out where we were.
You're struggling so hard to always be together that instead of being helpful, that was really frustrating and anger creating?
Yes.
Well, like one example is that, like, I'm more intellectually oriented and Bob's more physically oriented, and I would always be angry at him because I wanted him to be intellectually oriented, and he'd be angry at me because he wanted me to be physically oriented. So I tried to be physically oriented, and I went and took a fencing course with him, and tried to pretend like I really wanted to do some of these things, and it was just disastrous. And then Bob tried to read some of the books that I was interested in reading, and I wanted to read them and talk about these things with me.
Come and be like me.
Right.
From the outside, we seemed like the perfect couple. We had a very nice home on a tree-covered boulevard, a little new baby and a new car.
In the suburbs yet? Or?
It was an established, very nice neighborhood. And from the outside, it just looked perfect, and yet we were very unhappy, extremely unhappy now that we look back on those years.
We were doing separate things at the time, and it wasn't that I was at home. I was teaching, and Bob was working, and so it looked like, look, they do have their own interests, but all the while just kind of eating ourselves up because we weren't the way we thought we had to be, and weren't able to enjoy being what we really wanted to be like.
How did this sounds like quite a shift from a being together, and I guess what it sounds like, pretty conventional sort of couple with all the trappings, nice house and baby and everything. And you speak as though now it is quite different. What caused that change? Or was it, maybe it wasn't any one thing, but what brought about the change?
Well, a couple of different things. One thing that happened was that we went to a group-type thing experience for married couples. And it was just a weekend deal, and I was really only there one night, but everybody in the room was married, and they were all telling different things that they didn't like about each other. And then the other person wasn't allowed to defend himself. Instead, he had to listen to what his mate was saying and try to show how he understood. And that was kind of encouraging to me, because before I felt like, I couldn't admit any of it you know, everybody else has everything perfect, you know, and I mean, rationally I didn't think that, but I made myself feel like that's the way, you know. So that was one big thing, was just being with other people and seeing that other people had problems and that life wasn't easy, and that was one thing that I think.
And you were just alone in that? You understand?
Bob and I were both there.
Oh, Bob, I see. I thought you said first that you were there.
I think before that, too, that I was really aware of some very difficult things in our marriage, how upsetting it was, and that I felt like there was a need for some kind of a change, because I was getting more frustrated with Carol and angry at her, and at one point I can remember pushing her down in an argument, and it was such a shock that I'd get physical with her, because we'd been married 4 or 5 years at that time, and here she was, the girl that I'd married, and it was just a real shock that I could get to that point where I was so angry and frustrated, or that we were both upset with each other.
I can see how that would be a jolt. I mean, here I am shoving the woman I loved and thought was okay.
And that was a frightening thing for me, terribly frightening.
How much further is this going to go, sort of?
Exactly.
So that, I gather that sort of made you realize, gosh, something's got to be done, or something's got to change. Is that?
Right, I was at the point where I felt that something had to change, or something wasn't right. The dream, you know, the marital bliss and the dream of the American home and everything, it just wasn't working out.
You just weren't living happily ever afterward, huh?
Right, and there were some other very basic, frightening things happening at this time. I was looking outside of our marriage for other relationships with other women.
And finding some?
I had two relationships outside of our marriage, and this kind of added to it also. It was very frightening.
How did that add to it, if I may ask? Added to your concern, or did it upset Carol, or didn't she know about it?
Carol had no idea. And it was only, within the last 2 months that Carol and I leveled with Carol this thing about open communication and being truly open with one another. That I told her, and that, I think, was the beginning of something just tremendous. This openness that I shared an aspect of my life with her that she had no idea about.
Now that sounds like a very nervy thing to do, and what brought you to that?
At the time I told Carol, she had major surgery and she was in the hospital. And
we came to nothing.
Good time to receive bad news.
I had visited her until maybe 11:30 at night. She was on a lot of drugs and things. And one night after I had gone home from visiting, I called her on the telephone and we had long talks. And I told her, I said, I have something to tell you. I think this is the time to do it, because I want to grow. I want us to grow together. I want us to be open with each other. And so I told her of my relations with other people. And it was very unnerving, because I told her, I said, you know, this could be the grounds for divorce. This could end our relationship. I don't want it to end. I want it to grow. I want it to be something beautiful. I really love you. I really want to be close to you, and I want it to work. And I said something, I just didn't feel right. Something had to change. I had to be open.
You were really taking a big risk, weren't you?
Yeah, I was very frightened.
How did this strike you in your weakened condition?
Oh, it made me feel terribly threatened. For several weeks after, it went like in waves that well, it was the biggest factor of change, I think, of all in our marriage, because it made me look at Bob completely differently. You know, I was able to perceive him as somebody separate. Look, he can go and he can relate to other people.
He can even have a relationship with another woman. I don't know anything about it.
Right. And I guess it made me really love him a lot more, because I felt, gosh, you know, he loves me enough that he wants this thing to work, and he's willing to lay it all on the line and take a big risk and not know what I'm going to do, and yet he's willing to do it, and because he wants us to be able to talk together and to be open. And so some days I'd feel, oh, this is really great, you know, everything's going to be wonderful, and then other days I'd be, oh, my whole world's falling apart, you know, what's going to happen? But
I'd like to find out a little bit more about that second part of it, because I can see it increased your respect for him in a way that, gee, he has a lot of nerve, and it took a lot of courage, and he is a separate person. But when you felt, oh, what were those feelings?
Oh, you know, tremendous fear that, not so much that he would leave me, but just the fact that if he could relate to other people, then I wasn't in control of my life anymore, or of his life. That, who knows, he talked about these instances in the past and everything, but who knows, you know, there may be some in the future.
What does the future hold?
And he might find somebody that's more lovable than I am, and that would be a lot kinder to him. And so you know, some days I was physically pretty ill. I was so afraid.
From that.
Right.
So it was mostly fear rather than jealousy or anger or hatred or that kind of thing?
Well, I felt jealous, too. Bob had an affair with 2 women, but he had also related to another woman, and it was the one that he had related to without having an affair with it made me feel most jealous, because I knew all the 3 women, and she was, to me, you know, somebody that you could really love.
Somehow the most threatening.
Right. So that was what was most threatening to me, was that somebody could be so appealing and warm, and that was threatening.
Sounds as though that whole experience just wiped out a lot of the security that you had felt and made you realize, oh, this is an iffy thing.
Right. Except that I don't know that really the security was ever there. It was just the grasping for the security and always wanting it, but never really having it. You know, or never really, I never felt, always wanting the control, but never feeling like I was in control. You know. So it was a good feeling.
Control and security that you imagined you had, but really when it came to the pinch, you realized, no, not only do I not have it, I never have had it.
Right. And I liked not having it, even though it was terribly frightening and threatening and upsetting and everything. Still, it was better, because...
Now, why was it better? It was very painful, but somehow better.
I guess because I really could see him as separate. You know, he wasn't under my control, and he could be a separate person by himself, and he could do things without me, and which kind of made me think, gosh, you know, maybe I could be separate.
That's what I wondered.
You know, maybe.
So seeing him as a separate person also made you realize, hey, you know, I'm separate too.
Or you know, maybe I could be.
Maybe you could be. Okay.
Yeah.
Bob, maybe there's no further answer to this, but it does impress me that you got to the point of having the courage to tell her this. Is there any story, any further story behind that? It's quite a step to take.
We've both been reading the book Open Marriage and dealing with this problem. I guess I wanted more out of our relationship than just going to work and coming home and going on vacations and entertaining people, and I wanted something more for us, and I wanted to relate to Carol as a kind of a vital human being that I respect and care for, not because I'm married, because we got married, but because I really care for her as a human being, and that wasn't happening. It just wasn't there.
So it was the fundamental dissatisfaction, plus maybe the couples group getting a start on things, plus reading that book, plus feeling that we haven't got the kind of marriage I'd like to have. And that gave you the courage to say, well, I'll take the chance.
I was uncomfortable inside.
I'll bet you were.
Myself. I guess maybe that's the reason I told her and wanted to talk about it.
That I can't really have an open relationship unless this comes out too.
Right, unless I'm completely open and honest and willing to communicate myself as a person with all my wants and desires and who I am as a person. If I couldn't, relate that with Carol, it's something.
Bob was always pushing for this openness,
Yeah.
He was always talking about, I want us to be more open with each other, and I want us to. But I never felt like, it was all kind of nice intellectual jargon.
This is so common. In other words, let's be more open.
Right.
You be more open.
Right.
And then finally you took the chance and decided, well, if I want more openness, I'll be more open.
Right, and I really didn't have much empathy after I told Carol. I didn't have appreciation for the grief and the sorrow that kind of thundered down on her shoulders. I just said, well, that's the way I am, Carol, and this is what's happened. But no empathy at all.
You've been so concerned with your side of it that really it didn't occur to you, or maybe you didn't really have the capacity to realize what it might mean to her.
Capacity.
Well, I thought, he was doing me a favor almost to just listen to me. Because he did let me talk, He did let me say, I really feel frightened, and it goes in waves, and some days I feel terrible. And he listened to me and everything, but always kind of with the attitude that, well, okay, get yourself together.
That's the way it is, and you handle it.
That's the way I am now. Come on. Accept it, accept me. And, but I was appreciative of just the fact that I could express it, because I was almost afraid to express it for fear, I have to appear strong, because if I appear weak, then he won't like me at all. If I just break down and say, everything's falling apart, he'll just, well.
And at the time I told Carol, I told her, I said, well, I feel that you're free, that you can relate to other men, or you're free to relate to anyone who you'd like to. Saying that up here, never realizing what would happen down here. And Carol was never a threat that way, because I felt like I knew Carol, that she was just incapable of dealing with other human beings in that way. And 3 or 4 weeks ago, Carol went to an institute and was really trying to work this out for herself, really trying to relate warmly, physically, to other men and women. This was difficult for her. And she was feeding this back to me. I wasn't at the institute. And that's when I broke down. There were 2 or 3 times where I just, at night, I was alone, in our apartment. I just broke down and cried. For 2 or 3 hours at a time. I just kept saying, I can't cope with this.
It wasn't so easy to be on the receiving end.
Right. I was terribly threatened and alone. And
in spite of the fact that your mind said, that's all right, that's fine.
Right.
Go ahead and relate to other men. But
I just wasn't there.
Your guts didn't tell you that.
Right. I was terribly frightened. Scared.
You want to say any more about that, about your experience of relating to other men?
Well, I've always been really uncomfortable with people expressing warm feelings. Like, people could be as nasty as they wanted to each other, and I felt perfectly comfortable. But if somebody said, oh, I really like you, or I really think you're great, I always had to sit there, oh, I wonder what they want, you know, and very suspicious and not trusting and everything. And so I was in a group a few weeks ago, and I worked some of this out, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but something happened, and I realized, Corky said, well, you know, you may interpret me as not being sincere when I express warm feelings to people, but the fact is I am sincere. And if you want to sit there and not think I'm sincere, that's okay. But I'm sincere, and something happened that I believed him and realized that people do have warm feelings for each other, and they're not always being phony, and it's okay. And once I realized this, then people could express warm feelings to me, and I didn't have to sit there and try to figure out what their motives were. And then just, you know, I just started feeling really comfortable expressing warm feelings to people. And before, like physically, I was really conscious of it. You know, if I was just sitting next to somebody and they put their hand on me like this, I knew, you know, right? And now I feel really comfortable in reaching out to people and touching them, putting my arms around, telling them I like them, really think they're great, they're attractive, they're warm, they make me feel good. And I can say things to make other people feel good now.
Sounds like perhaps the fundamental change in that is that, well, two, perhaps. You began to trust other people more, but also you began to think, maybe I am lovable.
Right. Yeah, that was the biggest surprise. Oh, could it really be?
Could it?
Yeah.
Could it possibly be?
Right. Yeah.
This has started with Carol and with myself since we've really been open with each other. Like, we've sat up all night and talked with each other, and that hasn't happened in 6 years.
There really is communication going on.
Right, finding out who that other person is.
This person you've lived with for 6 years and haven't really known, is it?
Right.
I mean, yeah.
It's exciting. It's,
Well, another thing that I think it's important is that before I felt like I had to be something. I had an idea in my mind about what image I had to put across, how I looked, how I acted, the kinds of things I said, and how I received other people, and how I had to be if Bob was going to like me, you know. And then all of a sudden I realized, you know, well, none of those things are anything at all like what I want to be. I don't want to be any of that stuff. It's not me at all. But so I think, you know, probably right now and in the future, I'm just going to be going through a kind of looking around stage where I'm going to give myself some chances to try out some of these other things, because I no longer feel like I have to be the way Bob wants me to be, or I have to, you know, if other people can look at me critically now and they can say things to me, oh, I don't think you should do that, or I don't think, okay, you know, that's how you feel, but I don't feel that way. I like this, you know. Whereas before I'd just be totally devastated, you know, oh, I've got to please people.
Yeah, but now you're saying sort of, to hell with this image stuff. Maybe I can blossom and be quite differentiated, really.
Right. And be a lot of different things.
Yeah.
You know, not have to be one thing,
Just
but
one.
different things to different people, and relate to each individual as it happens, you know, and not feel like I have to set up patterns or anything like that.
Doesn't sound like any more talk of possible divorce at the present time.
No, I don't think
No.
so. Really, I don't think we were at the stage that
No.
we could have considered it before, because it was so, you know, we so deeply ingrained cultural impositions that, you know, this is what we have to be. And I kind of identified with something you said about, you know, being committed to the process of marriage. Although I think we were committed, but it wasn't a kind of inner commitment to the process. It was mostly an externally imposed commitment that we thought, we have to make this work. And I was always thinking, well, gosh, even, you know, that just not being married to Bob wouldn't solve any of the problems, because no matter where I go, I'm going to take me with me.
You'll be right with you.
Right.
Well, we may want to talk further, but this has been, you've really been awfully open, and I do really appreciate that very much. And we've got to we've got to call it quits for the time being, but it's been very, very nice. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. I've liked it, too.
I'm making these comments right after my chat with Carol and Bob. I suspect you would see as much in this as I do, but I'll just review some of the things that were very striking to me, because it seemed a tremendous example of change in a marriage that I really wasn't quite prepared for. First of all, I thought it pictures the barrenness of conventional marriage. Their first 4 or 5 years sounded, well, like the frustrations and the anger and the disillusionment that so many people go through in trying to live. That disillusionment was building to what I would regard as a pretty serious point. Then I suppose I'm biased in this because of my own interest, but it does come through to me the role that groups played in changing each of them. First there was the couples group, and then later group experiences. Probably one of the most exciting things was the dawning discovery, particularly on Carol's part, of the value of separateness. The struggle they'd had to be alike, to always do the same things, have the same interests and all that, began to vanish into a realization that marriage of two separate persons is much more valuable than a marriage of two duplicates. And that seemed to be one of the outstanding things that enabled them to change. Then, of course, Bob's courage in revealing his affairs, I felt we didn't discover really all that built up to that courage, because that was a big risk and it took a lot of courage. He'd been in a group, he'd read a book that helped him, and as he says, he really wanted their marriage to be more than it was, but he did take a big risk in letting her know, and it's kind of amusing and perhaps typical that he waited until she was in a weakened state before he was able to tell her about them. But that was partly because also at that point his desire was very strong to somehow remake their marriage. Couldn't they do something different with it? And it's interesting that he was so concerned with the risk he was taking and what he was telling her that there was almost a complete lack of understanding on his part of the effect this would have on her. He evidently had, Carol gave a very good picture of the impact it had on her, that she felt, here's her world collapsing all around her. She no longer had control. That was interesting, that she must have felt previously, perhaps had assumed it, that she was in control of her life and in control of his, that they were jointly in control. And now suddenly that had completely vanished. Also, I think she had assumed, probably they both had assumed, a security that really had dissolved, and they weren't aware of that fact. And then she was threatened, and quite naturally was jealous of the person who was most attractive. I've come to wonder about jealousy. Maybe I'll say some more about that later. But along with all this fear, real fear, and a feeling that everything was collapsing, was a dawning feeling that if he can be separate, maybe I could be separate too. And that evidently was that was what helped to counteract the fear and enabled her to really begin to launch out for herself. I thought, too, it was terribly typical that they had talked a good deal about openness of communication. They both wanted to be open in their communication, with the real message being, you go ahead and be open. And it wasn't until Bob took the risk of telling her of his affairs that she decided somebody's got to start this, somebody's got to start being open, and I'll take the risk of starting to be open. So, and as I say, I think that is so characteristic that people feel, yes, I'd like openness. You go ahead and be open. Then Carol's experience in the recent group, where she had always put off all warmth and love and so on, was always suspect what motives were behind anybody who tried to be warm or loving toward her. And her gradual coming to trust other people, and even more exciting, the fact that she began to realize herself that, hey, maybe I am lovable. Maybe it isn't all put on. Maybe some people really like me for myself. And that, I'm sure, was a very growing experience for her. Then the result of that was also both fascinating and I think typical, that this was exactly what Bob had wanted. Yet how did he feel? He wept several nights. He felt scared. He felt real jealousy. I sometimes think perhaps jealousy is much more deep-seated and even almost perhaps instinctual than we think it is. There's both of them. When there were outside affairs, or the possibility of an outside affair, felt really jealous and felt that in their guts. Intellectually, both of them felt openness, open relationships, that's fine. But when it comes down to the real fact, jealousy enters in. I like the part because, I suppose because it fits in with my own thinking, that Carol just could not keep up the image that she had so carefully constructed during all the early years of marriage. I'm a nice person, I'm attractive, I do things properly, I keep everything the way it should be. And gradually she let that image go and decided none of that was herself. And and that the thing she wanted to be was her own real, unique self. That, I think, really furthered the separateness. She was a separate person, he was a separate person. So what was the result of that? The result of that is that now they can talk all night excitedly, exploring new facets of each other, finding that each one is a very interesting person in himself or herself. Then Carol's realization that no matter what happened to their marriage or anything else, her own self was something she would have to take into any situation. That, to me, had a lot of meaning. I think that discovery had a good deal of meaning to her, that was the one thing she couldn't leave behind. She could leave her marriage behind if she decided to, but herself would always be with her. And so now she's trying to explore and be more of that real separate self, which I'm sure makes her a much more interesting person to Bob and a much more interesting person to herself. And I think much the same thing is going on with Bob, though he didn't talk about it quite as much. At any rate, with the kind of communication which they have now, it certainly sounds as though if they can keep that up, if they can really be open with each other about their feelings and their thoughts and their excitements about each other, and I don't mean they can keep that up permanently on an even keel. I'm sure there'll be ups and downs in that. But as long as they can fundamentally communicate what is real, each of them communicating from his own separateness, I must say I think the marriage has a very good prognosis. One final thought. As I said at the first, it seemed to me this was a situation in which the change was truly remarkable. It has all come about, as I get it, in the last couple of years at the most, and some of the most dramatic changes have even been in the last few months. I think that's more change and more rapid change than you usually see in a marriage. And one factor I haven't mentioned in it is age. I don't really know their age, but it's obvious they're both young people. And I think change perhaps comes more readily then than it does 10, 15, 20 years later. But at least with their youthfulness and the help they've gotten from being in small groups, and some of the help they've gotten from reading, and some of their own desire to want to make the marriage work. It's clear that during the period of disillusionment, there was still a desire to make the relationship grow and work, not fall to pieces. I think those are some of the factors that make it look very hopeful for the future.